Today we have an Africa whose nation states have been drawn by not Africans, but was drawn at a conference in Berlin by European nations as part of the scramble for Africa. So today at Civicus and GCAP, I've jokingly been saying, if Europe can have a euro, why can't Africa have an afro? And why don't we think about greater political economic integration? That was picked up by the African Union last year when their main conference was towards a union government, and there were serious conversations about whether Africa should move towards the United States of Africa. Therefore, it is particularly sad in a context where those kinds of conversations are happening that the tragedy that we saw in South Africa, where the extremely poor South Africans attacked extremely poor brothers and sisters from other parts of Africa, and it was the extremely poor locally competing with the extremely poor from other parts of Africa for extremely little. And that tragedy of loss of life, fear, people having to go back home, people still living in resettlement camps waiting to be reintegrated into communities, is not so much a failure of the people that were engaged in those actions. Of course, we need to do work to educate people about our common Africanness and so on. However, what is most revealing about what happened in South Africa during the xenophobic violence was an absolute lack of political leadership. It was too slow, too little, too late. President Mbeki, for example, has not visited one community that has been affected by the violence. And this is particularly a shame for the ANC leadership in our country, because when we were in exile, the ANC and other parts of the liberation movement, the solidarity, the compassion, the warmth, the welcome, the resources that we drew from countries who welcomed us with open arms when we were fleeing the terror of the apartheid regime, has not been reciprocated in post-apartheid South Africa. So what's needed now is that we have to really move from the politics of denialism, and sadly, the government of South Africa does stand accused of engaging in the politics of denialism around Zimbabwe, denialism around crime, denialism about HIV/AIDS, and denialism about xenophobia. In my previous job as the Executive Director of the South African NGO Coalition, 10 years ago in 1998, July, at the National NGO Conference in South Africa, we pushed an anti-xenophobia resolution where we call on the NGO community to recognize that this was a problem that needed to be addressed. Now, that was in 1998. So there cannot be any excuses that we didn't see it coming, that it was a shock, and so on. And even last year, there was an attack on the Somali community in the Western Cape. That was a very clear warning sign. And unfortunately, the government as a whole, and the ANC is a political party that I believe holds a special debt to the countries in all over the African continent that gave us solidarity, and I believe that debt has not been paid, and the best way we can pay that debt going forward is to seriously address the cancer of xenophobia that we have seen exhibited during this terrible violence that we've had in South Africa recently.